Join me to paint this fun-filled watercolor bird painting. I'm mixing olive green with indigo to get dark and deep bluish green to paint the first bird. I'm going to make an oval shape using wet on dry technique and feathering technique. I'm applying this deep bluish green using wet on dry technique. Then I dip my brush and release some pigment and water by pressing it against the wall of the bottle. Afterward, I go over the wet paint to soften its edges. This is the feathering technique. Finally, I complete the process by making an oval shape for the body of the bird using the remaining pigment on the brush. A detailed explanation of the feathering technique is available at the end of the video, so don't miss the concept if you want a thorough understanding of the feathering technique. At the place where we use the wet on dry technique, I am sprinkling some salt to create texture on the feather of the bird. Next, using the remaining pigment on the brush, I paint the tail of the bird. This tail is more like an elongated triangle shape. Next, I'm picking up indigo pigment, and using that pigment, I'm going to add a couple of feathers on both sides of the triangle. Using the same indigo pigment, I paint the feet of the bird. I'm going to add the eye and beak of the bird after the wet area is completely dry. I let this bird to dry completely and I move on to paint the second bird. I wash my brush thoroughly in water and then I pick French ultramarine pigment. The second bird is going to gaze at the first bird, so I'm adjusting the board according to my comfort and then starting to paint the second bird using wet on dry technique. I release some of the pigment from the brush and then I go over on the edges of the wet area and soften the edges. I'm sprinkling salt over that wet area before it starts to dry. Using the pigment on the brush, I create the body of the bird. Using indigo pigment, I start painting the tail, which is then followed by French ultramarine. Next, I'm using indigo pigment to paint the feet of the bird. I mix cerulean blue with small amount of Viridian green to get teal blue. This teal blue is then mixed with small amount of indigo pigment to get a rich blue. The first two birds are painted with an idea that they are gazing at each other, while the third bird is a completely different one. This bird is painted as if it is looking at something on the ground. So to paint this third bird, I make two strokes on both sides as in the video using wet on dry technique. I reduce the amount of pigment in the brush by dipping it in water, and I go over on the edges of wet paint to soften the edges I'm using feathering technique. Then I sprinkle some salt on wet paint to create texture for the feather. Using the light value of the pigment which is remaining in the brush, I complete that oval shape. Using the same light value on the brush, I paint the tail of the bird in the form of elongated triangle. Using the pigment which is a mix of cerulean blue, Viridian green and indigo pigment that is on the palette, I add a stroke on the tail. I make another stroke using indigo pigment. Using indigo pigment, I paint the eyes, beak and feet of the birds. Now I'll try to explain feathering technique in watercolor. This technique is used to create soft edge or to create gradual transition of color from dark value to light value. This is done by first applying watercolor paint, then when the paint is still wet, using a clean damp brush, you can gently go over the edges to soften the edge of the paint. You have to give a very light sweeping motion to feather the edges, creating smooth transition of color from dark value to light value. This feathering technique requires a lot of practice. This video is fully about feathering technique. Hope you enjoyed painting the birds and learning about feathering technique. See you in another video. Until then, take care and bye bye from Prema.